I'm Benjamin Rivers from Worse Than Death, and you're listening to the True North Country Comics Podcast.
Welcome to the True North Country Comics Podcast, dedicated to promote Canadian comic book creators and supporters. It's April 5th, 2021. I'm John Swinimer. If you want to drop me a line, you can contact me at john@truenorthcountrycomics.com. On this episode, I chat with Ben Rivers about Worse Than Death. This podcast is available on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts, and it's also available on the True North Country Comics channel on YouTube. I invite you to like and subscribe. Ben has been mixing comics and video games for decades. His last graphic novel, Snow, was nominated for a Joe Shuster Award, saw a wide release through Diamond, and was even adapted into an independent feature film, as well as naturally an adventure game. The Worse Than Death comic book series debuted digitally in spring 2020, and is a must-read for fans of horror, manga, and stories set in the Canadian city of Toronto. This dark emotional tale acts as a follow-up to the critically acclaimed game of the same name, which has spooked audiences on Nintendo Switch, PS4, Xbox, Steam, and the App Store. It's been lauded by outlets worldwide, including the LA Times, and was named Best Indie Game of 2019 by Rue Morgue magazine. And so, without further ado, here's my chat with Ben Rivers about Worse Than Death. So, Ben Rivers, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you so much for having me on the show.
I appreciate your time. What I normally do to start off the interview is ask the creator about their first comic book. So I'm wondering if you remember, what was the first comic book that you read?
I remember the first collection of comic books because it was everything around the early 80s. So it was a collection of hand-me-down, like X Factor or X-Men comic books that my brother gave me, plus Archie stuff that my mom would pick up for me from the grocery store. So the specific first one, I can't remember, but I always had a collection of those things around me all the time.
Cool. Yeah, that's good stuff for sure. So I'm wondering, who influences your work today? Who are you reading today?
So it's so funny because I grew up reading mostly Western comics and Archie and things like that. But as I've gotten older in life, I started getting into manga as that sort of became more prevalent in the 90s. And one of my missions over the last year and a half is to just clear out every blind spot in the manga world. And I've been reading a ton of Naoki Urasawa, who's one of my favorite artists, and Mitsuru Adachi. So Naoki Urasawa made books like Master Keaton and Monster, I think is probably one of his most famous ones. He's got like a show on Japanese TV that you can watch on YouTube. And he's just one of these masters who's been around since the 80s and kind of keeps producing work. And Mitsuru Adachi is one of my favorites because he also started becoming really popular in the 80s, but he has sort of consistently created these beautiful dramas that are also sports comics, but also romance stories. And he has this incredibly simple and wonderful style that just gets better with age. And there's something about the way both of these two mangaka create that I find like a target I want to get to. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but they're just so inspiring in terms of how they, conceive scenes, draw, compose everything, keep their lines to a minimum, all that stuff. It's absolutely beautiful. One last thing was the horror front was an obvious one, which would be someone like Junji Ito on the manga side.
I mean, when you say you're going to cover as much of the manga as you can, I think that's a huge task. Do you think that
Totally.
you'll ever get to the end of it? Or
we're so lucky that the Toronto Public Library system has a humongous collection of manga. So there's a lot of stuff that I've always wanted to read, and I'm just surprised that I can get so easily. I mean, the stuff that I grew up reading was sort of whatever was more accessible throughout the 90s and 2000s. And then I sort of would just pick up stuff here and there as someone recommended it to me. And it was my wife who got me into, we actually bonded in college over comics and manga. That's sort of how we became friends initially. And she's the one that always told me to look up new stuff. So I'm just discovering a whole bunch of stuff, especially from the 70s and 80s that I knew about and never read. And now it's kind of just become the staple of what drives what I'm doing now.
Great. Good to hear. Well, we're here actually talking about your latest project called Worse Than Death. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about it, maybe the origins of the project too.
Sure. So I call it's like a horror story that's secretly just a romance. And it's technically a comic book sequel to a video game that my wife and I released in 2019. So it takes place about like a decade or so after the events of the game. And it's meant to be a story that you can just pick up without knowing anything that goes on in the game. But it was essentially just me wanting to continue the story of some of the characters from that game. And it's about this woman named Holly and this other woman named Mia. Now, normally in like sort of classic horror movies, you would have like a final girl and like a monster. You know, there's always the trope of those two being the sort of last character standing at the end of the film. And what I want to do is write a story where it's about the final girl and the monster, but what happens if they fall in love? And then where does sort of all those horror tropes go wrong? So all the tropes of sort of horror related stuff about the impending dread and a person who's meant to sort of deal with this, unending horror that is this monster are there. But then when we throw in these two characters actually meet and they have more in common than they realize, things start to go sideways.
Okay. Sort of sounds like what happens if the creature from the Black Lagoon actually falls in love with the girl and it's a girl, I guess, right?
Exactly.
Okay, interesting. So you mentioned that this was originally a game. In doing my research, I found out that it's on all platforms. So I got to congratulate you for doing that. That's not an easy feat to do. So with that in mind, I'm wondering, what is your preference? Do you prefer game development or comic book development?
The easy answer is that while I'm working on a game, it's usually so stressful that all I'm thinking about is how great it would be to be working on a comic. And then when I'm working on a comic, what I'm thinking about is how much cooler this would be if I could take a bunch of these scenes I'm writing and then put them into a game form or have them interactive, or, have them imbued with choice. I always want to do the thing that I'm not doing at the moment. The real answer is, both mediums are obviously so different, but they're more alike than a lot of people realize. And this story in particular I wouldn't have come up with if it wasn't for the fact that I had done the game, because of who the characters that are brought over from the game ended up being and sort of what they meant in terms of like my relationship to them and what kind of story device that they can provide. But they also, like the game itself wouldn't have existed as well as a comic, because the things that you have to do in terms of the terrible discoveries you make and what you do to get there needed that interactive element to be truly gripping. And there's some things that we pull from essentially from comics to tell the story in the game, sometimes quite literally. And that stuff all informs that and made that better. But the whole time I was thinking, like, this story has to be a game, the original Worse Than Death. But boy, I want to take these characters somewhere after this and kind of see what happens, after the events of what goes on in the game.
Now, I know the tools are very different when you're creating a game versus creating a comic. But was there anything that you took from the game development that aided you beyond the narrative, let's say, the technical side, in creating your comic book?
Absolutely. So what happened was when we were creating Worse Than Death, before when we were doing digital art, if it was me doing it, for example, I'd be using a tablet, on my computer. But then Procreate came out at some point prior to or during the development of Worse Than Death. And I adopted that, and all the high-res art that got put into the game was me on my iPad Pro. Mm. So that ended up being this huge boon. It ended up opening all these doors. I could do so much more than I couldn't do before, because I didn't have to be tied to my, desktop computer and whatnot. And so all the processes I took from that, even in terms of sort of how I designed the characters to make them easy to replicate, over and over and over again, all this different kind of art, made it so that when I came to do the comic, I knew I was going to be using a digital component to do so. So even though I draw the comic in pencil on paper, all the finishes and inks and whatnot are all done in Procreate, because I have all those tools already there.
Cool. Now, I noticed also in reading some of the issues that Toronto is a background that's really prominent. Was that on purpose, or did you feel an affinity for Toronto? What was your reasoning for that?
It's absolutely on purpose. So I jokingly call Worse Than Death, it's the third chapter of my Queen Street trilogy, because my previous two books that I did, Snow and Empty Words, those also took place on Queen Street West, which is where I live, and have lived in sort of various components thereof for the past several years. And I always love doing things in Toronto, because just like when we watch, television shows that are American shows or whatnot, you can recognize a ton of Toronto or Canadian locations. And in doing so, you just realize there are all these great elements that exist. There's warehouses, there's spooky factories, there's abandoned apartment buildings, there's all sorts of sort of weird land that hasn't been used for anything in a long time, and there's all these great locations that seem kind of alien but are really just sort of a couple blocks away from anything else. And I really like the idea that you can have a story set in a city that can feel fantastic, but you realize, if you just sort of go off maybe one street you're not used to, there could be something a little bit weird over there, and that's kind of what makes horror fun.
Speaking of horror, that's a good topic to switch to, because I have talked to other creators, and I always pose this to them. Do you think that horror, and it's very prominent right now, is a result of us looking for an escape from, right now we're currently in a pandemic, but do you think it's traditionally horror is an escape from the reality of our lives? What's your take on that?
I think horror is therapy. Like, all the best horror content is about taking something that the creator was thinking about or feeling or worrying about and presenting it in usually a more extreme or fantastical way. The movie Dawn of the Dead is one of my favorite examples, that it's sort of about consumerism, but presented with this much larger lens. And I think a lot of written stories as well are all about issues that writers were grappling with at their time. For me, horror has always been attractive because I grew up watching horror movies with my brother, and, I always loved sort of spooky fiction. And it was, I guess, the combination of being kind of creeped out and afraid of it, but also being too attracted to sort of turn away, that made it so interesting. And I think real life is like that, where you kind of want to know what's going on, but you don't because it's too scary. And horror presents a lens through which you can dive into some other potential topics, whether they're, real life topics or just sort of metaphors for other more human topics, without maybe fear of getting it wrong too, and presenting it in a way that a larger audience can understand. Because I find if I talk about certain things, it might just seem trite or uninteresting to other people because it may not be that important to someone or that interesting or that scary. But through the lens of something much more metaphorical, like, this sort of monster situation in Worse Than Death, or in the case of the game, it's about a high school reunion, a lot more people can relate to that. And that's what makes it so attractive.
Sure, that makes sense. So you're out with issue number 3 of Worse Than Death. So I'm wondering, what's next for you? What do you have down the road that you can talk about?
So the idea is that we will be collecting this in print for TCAF 2021, and we'll actually be able to make a print version on sale, which will be the first print book I've actually done in several years. And then from there, it's just getting the rest of the book done. The outline's all written. I sort of know the plan of where the book is going to go, but of course, there are always some fun things that pop up along the way where you come up with a better idea. And doing the comic during the last year was basically like my art therapy for dealing with just being burnt out from work and also just the reality of the situation in the world right now. And so I kind of don't want to be done the book for a little while because I'm having too much fun diving into it. It gives me, as a creator, an escape, maybe even more so than the reader.
Sure. No, that makes sense. So I'm wondering where people can find out more about you online and through social media to find out what you're up to now and what you're up to down the road.
Yeah, I'm busy online. So you can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Rivers. And you can find, this is going to sound real familiar, you can find me on the internet at benjaminrivers.com. And you can find me on Instagram and YouTube at Benjamin Rivers Inc. That's INC at the end.
Great. Well, then those are all the questions I have for you, but I'm wondering if there's something I didn't ask that you'd like to get across in this interview.
Sometimes people wonder why I want to mix romance and horror, and I find that those two genres are surprisingly similar. They have a lot of very similar beats, and if you read really good, heart-wrenching, like sort of cheeseball romance stories, you'll notice that they are often very similar in structure to horror stories in terms of what they do to their characters and when they sort of pull the wool over their eyes. So I always implore people who maybe half like even one of those genres to check something out like this, because you'll be surprised how much you can get away from it.
Thanks to Ben for the chat. You can discover more about Ben on Twitter at Benjamin Rivers and on Instagram at Benjamin Rivers Inc. You can discover more about the Worse Than Death comic at worsethandeathgame.com/comic. And thanks to you for listening to the True North Country Comics podcast. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to and like this podcast on Apple Podcasts, and please leave a good rating. Also check out the TrueNorthCountryComics.com website and follow along on Twitter at True North Comics. True North Country Comics is now on YouTube. Please like and subscribe to the video channel. Please send your feedback to John at TrueNorthCountryComics.com. Thanks again for listening, and come back soon for another episode. Bye for now. True North Country Comics Podcast is copyright True North Country Comics, copyright 2021.